Chuck, tell me how you're doing today.
I'm doing well, Marty. Good to see you, buddy. How are you?
I'm fabulous, and part of why I'm fabulous is because, and this happens virtually every time you and I meet,
Yep.
I keep saying the sentence, we should have recorded that.
Yeah, that's true.
And so this podcast starts literally with us going back in time for about 5 minutes going,
right.
Let's record that.
Let's repeat what we just talked about.
That's right. And so for our listeners, it's no surprise at this point that I'm a Star Trek fan. And we were talking about some episodes of Star Trek, both new and old, that we liked. And a lot of that had to do with rules and the appropriate time to listen and the appropriate time to question.
Yep.
Maybe even act in conscience that's not covered by doctrine.
Right.
And in that space of conscience and doctrine, Star Trek was wonderful for that. It's always questioned sort of the how do we think about this and should we think about it that way? You were bringing up some prime examples about exactly that.
Right. Yeah. The issue that goes back to Auftragstaktik, and this was prompted by a comment from my buddy Angelo. Hey, Angelo, I know you're listening. An episode of Star Trek that he watched saying that it reminded him and his wife of things that I had written about and communicated to them regarding Auftragstaktik and judgment and, a leader versus a follower and your responsibility for both, that kind of stuff. And yeah, these situations are quite thorny. And then I move the discussion to talking about why large militaries tend to inadvertently, I don't think they plan on doing this, but culturally they become doctrinaire because large militaries like to have order and discipline, and it can be chaotic if too many people misunderstand what they're allowed to do, what they're supposed to do, what they're expected to do, because those are three different things. So it's much easier just to set procedures in place, SOPs that you and I would be familiar with, standing operating procedures, and people just follow them. But occasionally you get an individual, rank is irrelevant, who is faced with a situation and the SOP says, at this point, you must do the following, right? Because it is what we expect you to do. But if that individual's been in uniform for more than 15 minutes, they've been slowly building experience and judgment. And the gut feeling might say, ooh, Marty, no, don't do this. This is not good. I really need to do the following. And it's not what the SOP says. Now, if you're in a large military and you've made this your life's work, you've got a family, you've got a mortgage, maybe this isn't a life and death situation. Maybe this is something that will affect your next posting, affect your next promotion, therefore financially and where your family gets to live. You might have a tendency to want to move to the safe side and not do what you know is the right decision. Because if you follow the SOP and things go badly, you cannot be found guilty of being negligent in your duty because you did exactly what you were supposed to do, even though you knew that it wasn't going to work. Right? So there's a real moral dilemma there because morally as an individual, and it really becomes a problem for senior leaders, right? Chief warrant officers, chief petty officers, colonels, general officers. When they've been around long enough, they know this is what we need to do. This is not what the book says we should do, right? And by the time you have been in the military for 30 some odd years and you've got that next rank and that next great job coming up, are you willing to risk it? Especially if it's not life and death. If it's life and death, then, the good leader will do what he or she has to do because it's life and death. But if it's not life and death, the safe bet is to follow the SOP, even though you know it isn't going to work. And that's a real problem for large institutions, particularly the military. right?
As you talk about that, I just think about, look, if you've served, service before self, like that's ingrained in all of us.
Right.
That said, there are some times when you go, that's not a life and death decision, and I should still have a space for whether or not I'm choosing what the military chooses for me.
Right.
And so I come back to the service will tell you you should always want your next promotion.
Right.
Okay. And what happens when we turn down a promotion, Chuck?
Things go sideways.
As you well know, I turned down a promotion at one point.
Yeah.
And things go. No, it didn't kill my career. It didn't kill everything else. And actually, I did it specifically to get my postgraduate work in.
Right.
Had a pretty good reason to finish. But I knew what was important, and the service I did not follow service doctrine, other than to say, please give me my admin review.
Right.
I refuse promotion. Give me my admin review. That is the procedure.
Right.
But that should be death of a career.
Often it is.
It
shouldn't be, but you're right.
But that's where I'm talking, and that's the space we're talking about is the doctrine set up the way that it really needs to if we're going to have both talent management and career progression? The military needs to be big and move. Individual talent needs to do what it needs to do. Where I think there's a really good question here, and I remember learning this from Rich Deviney, the former Navy SEAL instructor. I don't know if it was his idea originally or if he got it from somewhere else, but he used to say part of the problem with special forces was scale breaks everything.
Right.
You can do it in a small team. But if I take that team of 15 and go to 60, go to 150, go to 1,000, whatever worked at 15, scale will break it.
That's a good point.
Yeah. And I think this space on doctrine is there's something between scale and what we know works that I don't know that we've wrestled to the ground.
I want to take us back a half step because I think part of the issue, and I agree with everything you said, part of the issue in my mind is how some people see doctrine. And as I used to say when I was teaching, doctrine, not dogma. Okay. So for all you Roman Catholics out there, we all know what dogma is, right? Thou shalt the following. And you don't really have a choice, right? You must do the following. We sometimes confuse dogma with doctrine and think, well, I have to do this. I learned a definition of doctrine late in life from, actually he was a U.S. Army armor master sergeant who, when he retired, got a PhD. And I actually met him when he was a serving sergeant. I didn't remember. He remembered me. I was a CO and we were sitting at a parade together, and his son stepped on my shoe, which destroyed the shine. And he was mortified. I really didn't care because I was never one of those guys. But that's why he remembered me. And suddenly we're teaching it at Norwich together because he was U.S. Army and I was Canadian Army. And his name was Doc. And Doc said, Chuck, as an NCO, I had a different view of doctrine than you as a senior officer. And, we were having a cup of coffee one day. And I said, well, tell me, Doc, what do you, and he said, well, I like to think that doctrine is just a common language. So if you are with me in military, then you and I need to have a common language. And that common language is doctrine. And I said, well, that's a wonderful way to talk about it, Doc. I like that. The problem, it works for guys like you and me. We were both career professionals, right? But that sometimes doesn't work if you've got a career professional talking to a conscript. Because the conscript hasn't been around long enough to understand the nuance of that language, right? So you come right out of language school and you think, hey, I passed all my language tests. I can now speak French. And you go to Quebec City and discover that you've insulted everybody you talk to because, you are putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable, right? So that's part of the issue, I think, that how we define doctrine. If we define doctrine as a set of rules that we have to follow, then yeah, it can become problematic. The other end of the scale, it's also problematic. Somewhere in the middle lies judgment, I think, right? Judgment. But, you know, probably more than I do about organizational behavior based on your training and your education. I haven't taken a lot of courses on educational behavior, but I've been an observer for my life. And we all know that the first law of any large organization is self-preservation, right? And anything that risks the organization is seen as a negative trait, even if it's going to make the organization better, right?
Well, it's funny, as you come back to organizational behavior, the first thing that jumped into my mind, as someone who had I'd already had my psych degree before I joined the military, and I joined as an NCM back then.
Right.
So the whole time I'm in basic training, I'm like, oh, they're using this operating conditioning to do this to me. Didn't change anything, by the way. Knowing what they're doing, you still go. If you want to survive, you follow through and you do it.
You do what you got to do.
That's right. But the principles that you were just talking about that really came back to me. I always come back to the dichotomy of responsibility. I'm able to respond.
Yeah.
And culpability. I'm blamable. And doctrine has both an area of responsibility. I must have a certain amount inside there, and culpability. Anybody who stood on the red X, self included, by the way, I got to tell you that I've definitely 4 times I've stood on the red X.
Once for me.
Okay. I was a little more challenging for certain people.
I was innocent.
By the way, I've never been convicted of a single thing in my life ever in any court anywhere. Never even made it to a trial. But I stood on a few red X's thinking that could happen. But on the red X, you're playing the responsible, culpable game in your head.
Yes.
Okay. Do I tell them? Don't I tell them? What do I tell them? You've known me a long time now. I tend to over-index on integrity. I'm going to tell you exactly what I did, why I did it. And before we even make it to trial, you're going to have every piece of detail you want. I'm also going to tell you what you didn't have and why in law this is going to work or not. You know what I mean? Yep. We have to understand the culpable side as well.
Yep.
First time my coxswain arrested me, I told him he did it wrong. Because I'd already been to policing school and I knew what the steps were. And I'm like, I'm going to tell you how to do it right because I'm so innocent. I want you to arrest me properly. And I don't want to get off on some bullshit. You arrested me wrong. But no, I'm so innocent. I'm going to tell you that.
I'm trying to picture that in my head.
It was fun.
Oh, yeah.
My coxswain was awesome. Now you have to remember, at the time I did this, I am an ordinary seaman, but I'm a 28-year-old ordinary seaman. I did not join till I was 25.
Right.
And I was educated. And so I did not get trained like some 19-year-old kid. I got trained like, no, you got a brain in your head.
Right.
You're not coming at this from BS. You actually have read a few things.
Right. Okay.
And I had a really good coxswain. So
Lucky
to be clear, wouldn't have pulled that with every coxswain.
No.
But Algonquin was a good ship with a good crew and had a coxswain willing to listen. But as you talk about doctrine, I literally walked through, this is what I did. Here's the doctrine. Here's the gap you're referring to. And here's my responsible choice. And I stand on this X, ready for whatever action comes my way. Culpable.
Right.
Not everyone at every layer can play that responsible, culpable game at that same space. And as commanding officer, you must have seen, and certainly I was an officer of the court, I saw a lot of responsible members. In other words, not my fault.
Yes.
And you brought that up. I followed my doctrine, not my fault. It's a fault kind of organization.
True.
And that colors, as opposed to say a support type organization. When you're doing your postgraduate, when I was doing my postgraduate work, that's a support system. Nobody there is trying to blame you when you get something wrong.
Correct.
They're there to correct you.
Yeah.
Oh, hey, that thing you thought over there, that's crazy. Here's a book on why that's crazy. Go read it.
That's right.
Support system versus blame system.
Yes.
As I bring that sort of space in there, thinking about doctrine, what comes to mind for you?
Oh, so much. Back to a conversation that I had with Angelo earlier in the week, which had to do with the two sides of the coin, one being um, one being rights and the other one being obligations. And he started the conversation by linking me to something I had not been aware of. But I guess last year or 18 months ago there was a Coast Guard captain, Canadian Coast Guard captain, who refused to respond to a mayday. And his crew was pushing him to respond. And on at least two occasions, he refused to respond. And the officer of the watch tried to give him the con of the ship, and the captain refused to take it. He refused to go into the harbor or the bay. Now, luckily, there was no loss of life because another ship in the area heard the call and went and rescued the fishermen. This was on the Atlantic coast. And so the Coast Guard did what it was supposed to do. It removed him from command, court-martialed him, or the equivalent. I guess there's civilians, unionized civilians, and fired him. And he grieved it, and it went to a superior court, and he lost. And so Angela wanted to know, what was my thinking on this? And I said, well, he's lucky that he wasn't in the Navy, because if he had done that in the Navy, he'd still be serving time in Edmonton, right? Because the law of the sea is quite clear. Captains have a legal as well as a moral responsibility to respond to a mayday. But that took us to the conversation of, what my father always taught me, which was, you have certain rights, but every one of those rights brings a responsibility. And we have lost, I think, a lot of that. I think I wrote about this in one of my posts. I think that was also something that Angela reminded me of, where I pointed out that it may have been last week, actually, but I'm not sure. Where this whole bit about, well, I have the right to vote, but in Canada, I don't have a responsibility or an obligation to vote beyond moral, right? But I like the Australian model where, yeah, you have the right to vote as a citizen. Guess what? If you don't vote, we're going to fine you because the law says you must vote. And I've always liked that. And people say to me, Chuck, that's unenforceable. We couldn't do that. And my response is always, hey, we enforce traffic laws, right? We enforce having to have a driver's license. We enforce all kinds of things that seem inane. This would be easy. You've got a voter's roll. If after election day, somebody comes to your house and says you weren't at your polling station, and you better have a medical excuse, or you're death in the family, or you were out of the country, or otherwise, write us a check. This is your fine, right? Because you have a right, and that right is offset by your responsibility, your obligation. And that is true in everything in my mind. That's the way my dad raised me. And so, as a commander, as a senior officer, I had rights that were given to me based on my rank and the position that I was filling. Right? So I had rights, for instance, as a commanding officer that my squadron commanders didn't have, that certainly my privates, corporals didn't have. But that meant I had a lot of obligations that they didn't have. I remember discussing this with the wife of a corporal because she had had maybe one drink too many at the regimental Christmas party, and was expressing an opinion that wasn't life grand to be the commanding officer. I could do whatever I wanted. I could come to work, not come to work. I said, listen, Elaine or Frederica or whatever her name was. And she wasn't being malicious, right? And her husband was standing there trying to pull her away. And I said to him, no, it's okay. It's all right. Yeah, I'm not upset. I would like to explain this so that she has a better understanding. And I said, so, do you know, for instance, that if one of the soldiers in this regiment, and there's 400 some odd of them, ends up in a traffic accident on the Autobahn at 2:00 in the morning, that somebody comes to my house and knocks on the door and wakes me up, is there anything that I'm going to be able to do at that hour? Well, no. the soldier's either been arrested or taken to a hospital, but they have to wake me up, right? Because I need to know that. Because if I come into work and I don't know that, I'm going to be pretty upset. And so every duty officer knows that. Wake up the commanding officer. Commanding officer needs to know, right? And that's just a really minor example of some of the things that I have to do that, that your husband doesn't have to do. So it was she actually, in spite of the fact that she had started by, poking her finger in my chest, she sort of said, "Oh, I'm all right. Well, I never thought of that. Thanks, Colonel." At which point the corporal made a hasty retreat.
But for a lot of people, they don't think about heavy is the head that wears the crown.
Indeed.
Okay. I just always remembered that from Shakespeare.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because it is a heavy head. And it always looks easy when Captain Kirk is throwing out orders.
Right.
But there's a lot of weight that goes with that. And so when we're talking about bringing it back to doctrine, dogma, the space of what is moral, what is correct to follow. And I'll even put this next piece in there. What are we designing next?
Right.
Okay. If you had told me 1 year ago, they were even talking about knocking the procurement process down,
right,
to like having a year type system, and that they're going to work with industry on quantum computing.
Right. Yeah.
I like literally, we couldn't have had this conversation 12 months ago.
Yeah.
And here we are, because evolving, we have to evolve our doctrine. We have to evolve our space. And as you know, change is sometimes glacial.
Mm-hmm.
Just try to go from a CFAO to a DAOD. That's for all of our military listeners.
They all know what that means.
That's right. It felt like that was like a forever process.
Yes.
And now speed of response is important.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And so coming back to this space about moral, how do we, in our last few minutes, align what we need to do morally with what we need to adapt doctrinally?
Oh, well, it's a process. It's a long process. And it goes back to one of my favorite answers to most questions, which is education. And by education, I don't mean, well, we need to send everybody on a course. No. We need to make sure that our leaders understand that they have these obligations as well as these rights and privileges. And most do, not all leaders, but most get it, because I think certainly my experience in the Canadian Army and the Canadian Navy for those few years that I was in was that one of the things that I learned very quickly was, oh, that's a bad example, so I won't do that. Oh, that's a good example. I'll try and do that, right? And so making sure that our leaders understand that they have not only a leadership function, but they also have an educational process that they have to try and ingrain into their leadership. And this takes us back to one of our earlier conversations, right? The difference between training and education. So the leader has an obligation to not only train subordinates, but also to educate them. How's that?
I love it. And I think the only postscript I would throw on that is, it's not just for training and educating your subordinates, but our country as well. Our country in 2025 and 2026, God bless this country, I love Canada, is getting an education.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
And why it's important to have a military, why risk and response are important, why procurement's important. You and I have been asking these questions for 30 plus years.
Exactly. Yeah.
The average Canadian is just waking up to some of these really important pieces because the world was safe.
Yeah.
And I always took that as good job, by the way. I always took that as good job. We did such a good job of making it safe. Nobody bothered to look under the hood.
Yes. Nicely put.
So thank you for today's conversation. And my only regret is I didn't press record sooner.
Oh, I think we captured it.
But I think we got it. Thank you for today, Chuck.
Cheers, man.